Soviet Russia scores a dramatic victory in the exploration of space with the launching of the first rocket to hit the moon. An historic scientific feat simulated in these scenes, which showed the course of the multi-stage rocket carrying the 858-pound Lunik. Bearing the Soviet coat of arms and hammer and sickle pennants, it traveled 35 hours through space. It is the first man-made object to voyage from one cosmic body to another.
We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through every mistake, failure, and explosion that made space exploration possible. My name is Quinn, and I'm joined by my friends
Chris,
Drew,
and the other Chris.
Yes, that is right, everyone. We have got our guest. We have got our first guest, actually. Andrew LePage is a space historian who's been writing for various journals, magazines, and other space sources for over 33 years now, covering several hundred articles, as well as the Drew Ex Machina blog, where, among other things, I have been sourcing from for a lot of our previous episodes. So, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. But my name is Drew LePage. I'm a physicist by training. And for the past almost 40 years, I've specialized in digital image processing applications of various sorts. I did a bunch of different things with different space-related projects. I worked for computer companies and whatnot, but for the past 30 years, I've been specializing in atmospheric remote sensing projects primarily. I dabble in some other stuff as it comes up. But currently, when we mentioned this earlier, I'm working as the chief scientist at the Boston-based startup Tropical Weather Analytics, as well as our partner up in Canada Weather Analytics, headquartered in Montreal, with a presence in Toronto. But
we will speak no more of this.
Speak no more of it.
The town that must not be named.
Because I have three of my great-grandparents are Canadian, so
okay.
Wow.
It runs there. But in any case, what we're doing at the company I'm working at right now is developing miniaturized weather satellites that we'd fly in pairs to do 3D observations of clouds and their motions to infer the winds and whatnot. As it turns out,
that is really cool.
As a layman, I love everything about that sentence. Every single word in that sentence, I adore.
Well, actually, we do have a website, weathersats.com, and a lot of my I haven't been doing all that much writing on my blog lately. I've been very, very bad. It's been almost 3 months since I've posted anything. I think it's the longest I've gone, but I have been writing a lot of blogs. Posts for the work-related stuff, including going back. We had one of our precursor projects involved making use of photography taken from the International Space Station to support the development of our algorithms to do 3D imaging of clouds and whatnot from orbit. So I've been lately publishing a whole series of blog posts that have to do with some of these 3D images. So bring your anaglyphic red-blue glasses, and there's all sorts of neat 3D images, a lot of the work that I do during my day job. But as far as what I do on the side, I'm also a space historian. Ever since I can remember, I've been into space. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s with the Apollo program and the beginnings of the space shuttle program and whatnot. So I was always heavily into space-related stuff, and had a special interest in especially once I got into college, and I was doing things with physics, so I could actually do some really neat calculations and whatnot. I was very much into the old Soviet program, which was very secretive way back then. And I actually got my start at writing about the latest revelations from the old Soviet space program that were coming out after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. So that's where I started doing my writing back in 1990. And well, like 33 years later, I'm still writing after, God, I think I have like 600 publications now or something like that.
Oh, wow.
It just adds up, doesn't it?
Yeah, just a few a year after year, and all of a sudden you got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of posts scattered all over the interwebs and whatnot.
Right.
So,
and I don't suppose there's ever like a point where it hits of like, I am now a space historian, but somewhere along the way.
It was kind of more of an appellation that was just kind of given to me by others who respected my work. And it's like, okay, I'll go there. I'm a space historian. So
I'm not complaining.
People with
half the time it doesn't seem like I'm so much a historian. I'm just reminiscing about stuff that I remember as a kid and whatnot. I'll write an article about some programmer or another that I distinctly recall reading about when I was a teenager or something like that. And
right.
I guess a lot of the younger folk are like, wow, I've never heard about that. That's neat.
Yeah, I was about to say some would argue that simply just remembering things that happened and being able to repeat them at some point in the future is history. So
yeah, I guess so. I'm just telling the stories I remember. Oh yeah, I like to put a little extra twist. I actually like to go back to the original peer-reviewed papers for scientific stuff, as well as the NASA reports and contractor reports, and try to build a unique narrative, not just the same old thing you hear over and over and over again, which over time is just becoming shorter and shorter, and you see exactly the same pictures again and again and again.
And then every single time someone, cuts a little paragraph here and there. Yeah, like you said, the story gets smaller and more condensed.
Eventually, different projects just evaporate away in a lot of histories and whatnot because it just so happened so long ago. So I guess I have the, not that I started out this way, but have the mission of basically going out there and reminding people how it all started.
These smaller projects are honestly a heck of a lot more amazing than a lot of stuff we're seeing nowadays.
Oh, especially given the state of the technology, everyyou was new. I mean, everything was new.
Oh, absolutely.
And they would try anything. And sometimes I look at what they did or attempted to do, and it's like, oh my Lord, you were way too ambitious. I've been involved in enough space-related projects since the 90s, and even back during the 80s, that it's just amazing. Especially when you see pictures of like people putting together these things, and they're just wearing T-shirts and stuff, and just regular
You're sneezing
work
into the electronics.
When FOD didn't exist as a word. Like looking at Thor Able, it almost looks like a Q-tip on top of a rocket, but the legacy left behind.
Oh, it was definitely very much a kludge, kludging together upper stages from Vanguard with the Thor IRBM. But like you mentioned, it had a huge legacy because that was the origin of the Delta family launch vehicles, which are still around today, totally different form. They have virtually nothing in common with the old designs. Oh, yes, absolutely.
And maybe the kind of lineage they would not be as excited to talk about if you were to ask them today. Yeah, and you mentioned some of these smaller programs. Like we did a couple of episodes on Vanguard, again, sourcing in large part from your blog, and just the fact that they picked that rocket, like that incredibly problematic and like kludge together rocket, to then kludge together with a different rocket to try and get these probes up. Like the fact that it had every stage had a different kind of fuel of like SRBs, kerosene, and then just everybody's favorite chemical ever.
Unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine.
Yeah, and inhibited red fuming nitric acid. I always blank on the first part. But.
Yeah, well, there is inhibited and there's uninhibited nitric acid. The uninhibited basically is just straight nitric acid. The inhibited has a little trace of hydrofluoric acid in it, and what happens is the hydrofluoric acid reacts with the metals in the propellant system, so that it forms a protective coat, so that the nitric acid won't react as readily with the.
So it almost flash coats those pipes as it passes through.
That's right, exactly. So
See,
that's
I told you guys this would be a good get.
The only things that I'm extrapolating immediately from this conversation is just that it seems to me that our rocket fuels are getting spicier as we go up the stages.
Oh, they
I
can
think the
get
top
spicier and
stage-
more tame.
Or perhaps down the stages. Maybe we started at the spiciest ones first.
Well, it depends on your definition of spicy, because I certainly considered things like hydrazine and nitric acid to be pretty spicy stuff. I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to be touching that.
Hydrazine is one of my nightmare chemicals.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I
we're
still,
gonna.
I still remember working with nitric acid when I was in school and chemistry labs and stuff like that, and not realizing I had one drop hit the top of my shoe until I got home and took it off at night, and it's like a nice little hole burned cleanly right through my top of my leather shoe and through my sock. With a nice yellow spot on my foot.
Okay, so it's not just programs that were more exciting back then. It was apparently school that was more exciting back then.
Yes, we had lots of fun. I cannot. I have absolutely no clue how they do chemistry classes nowadays compared to what I was doing chemistry classes in high school in the late '70s and college in the early '80s. It's got to be completely different.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yours was the incident report that made them realize, all right, we cannot be giving these kids nitric acid. We cannot just be letting them fill it like super soakers and have fun on recess with it.
Oh, well, then again, I mean, that was also really good because in my very first job out of college, one of the things that I had to do was I was working on developing means of manufacturing mirrors for X-ray telescopes. And we were trying to figure out a way of being able to like etch information on the pieces of glass. And I was the one who was volunteered to basically don all the gear and use hydrofluoric acid to try to etch glass. So my nitric acid experience definitely was very useful.
Yeah, you just sitting there like, yeah, I've dealt with worse.
Oh yeah.
I would rather that have been my experience. My closest experience was being related to, yes, we have 20 55-gallon drums full of we don't know. 2 of them were just labeled methyl ketone, and you will see me running before I crack those open.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, and kind of going back a bit, you mentioned that you got your start writing about the Soviet space program just as all of these documents were getting declassified.
Right, back in the early '90s, after the fall of the dissolution, shall we say, of the Soviet Union.
What was the phrase? Openness? I can't remember the Russian translation.
Let's see, there was perestroika, and then there was another one. I'm trying to remember which one was which. Glasnost. That's right.
Glasnost.
So I mean, there was the beginnings of some information being shared. In fact, I think my very first article I wrote, I think in 1990, had to do with the Soviets and then the Russians' Mars 1994 mission. And there was, I mean, usually you heard nothing about these missions up until that point in time. You heard nothing about those missions until they're actually launched, or maybe you get some vague thing. We're going to launch something next year. But they were incredibly open about what they wanted to do with that Mars 94 mission, which unfortunately never ended up launching. And they really downscoped it and eventually became the Mars 96 mission, which ended up failing.
Oh yeah.
Oh
man, the amount of incredibly expensive projects that just fail because rockets can't get them to orbit.
Oh yeah.
I've been reading up on Polyus recently, the Soviet laser battle station.
Oh yes, that was on the first Energia launch.
Yeah, a bit flip made it spin 180 degrees too far, and it just deorbited itself.
I would like to interject. I've been going through your blog, and some of these articles are amazing. Especially the Lincoln experimental satellite. They just started retransmitting out of nowhere.
Oh yes, the zombie satellite.
That is amazing. And
there was another one of those programs that I just remembered as a kid, and it's like write an article about it, and people hadn't heard about it.
After almost half a century, it starts retransmitting. What the heck?
I have not heard of it. I'll have to go and check this.
It sounds terrifying.
Check out zombie satellites.
Read it. It's very good. Back to the subject.
So with what we're going to be talking about today, what got you interested first in looking at these earliest, so this series of articles, what got you interested in writing this and covering the topic of this first kind of moon race, these first probes to either fly by or just slam straight into the moon?
Well, there were a lot of mysteries when I was getting into the Soviet space program and whatnot during the 1980s after I got into college, and had a lot of good sources available to me. Of course, Aviation Week and Space Technology, which was a fantastic source at the time for these getting good details on the Soviet space program. But there was still a lot of secrecy surrounding the Soviet space program, including the possibility of there being a whole bunch of failures early on during their various programs. And there were certainly suspected launch failures during 1958, leading up to their first successful lunar probe, Luna 1. But I just like the mystery and trying to piece it all together. And then once I started studying physics and got my degree, I had the mathematical tools that I could actually work out things like orbits and start inferring all sorts of interesting things about what could and couldn't happen and what was possible and what wasn't possible, and took it from there.
Neat. The most use I've gotten out of my orbital mechanics classes is playing Kerbal Space Program with pen and paper. But yeah, and definitely useful to be able to like apply those tools and see like what's realistic, what is a lie.
Right, exactly. What can you do in working out orbital windows and whatnot? In fact, I've continued to do that with a lot of Venus and Mars probes, Soviet Venus and Mars missions, gone back to the original papers on the orbital mechanics put out by JPL at the time, trying to figure out launch windows and using that information to infer the actual missions of some of these early failed missions.
Okay.
Yeah, that was one nice tool to have. But with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there became available tons of information. Basically, the KGB was out of business and people were more than willing to talk about all the neat stuff they had been working on for the previous 30 plus years on the space programs that they had been associated with. By the mid 1990s, even the various design bureaus, newly formed corporations, like, for instance, Energia, which was originally formed back in the 1950s by Sergei Korolev, OKB-1, the Experimental Design Bureau 1. So I actually have a couple of books in my library in Russian that I picked up during my years traveling to Moscow. They were more than willing to give all the information and why things failed. There are lots and lots of biographies that have come out about Korolev, various people involved in different aspects of the Soviet space program have also published memoirs and whatnot. So there just all of a sudden became a whole bunch of information available and a lot of fresh narratives to be writing, such as about the initial race to get to the moon in the 1958-1959 timeframe.
And I have to imagine that like a lot of rocket scientists have basically been told through their whole careers for like upwards of 40 years at that point, like, no, you cannot talk about the thing you did. All that cool stuff you did, no, you cannot say anything, not even to like your friends or family. So as soon as that barrier comes down, they are just going to go at it.
Oh, absolutely. But the same thing even happens in this country. A lot of my career doing space-related projects are defense projects, and more often than not, they're inconveniently classified. So there's a bunch of really cool stuff that I've done during the course of my career I can never talk about, at least until following the dissolution of the United States or whatever.
Oh, no. Oh, and you're just going to tease our audience like that, just saying there's so many more cool things they could learn about if only a certain nation were to, I don't know, get embroiled in civil war. Quinn, edit this out.
I just had a really dumb thought.
Okay.
And I'm thinking about all those poor guys that had to be stuck out in Kazakhstan that finally get to vent about how awful it was to be in the middle of a desert for months on end. They can finally talk about it, decades later.
Yeah, I'd love to see a book just on all of like the Soviet rocket scientists, the entire Scorpion versus Camel Spider leagues that I'm sure they had, just like, soldiers in Afghanistan. The weird diseases they caught.
Yeah, that was definitely not an easy assignment, although one can make the same claim about the various missile ranges here in the United States. White Sands comes to mind immediately.
Right. Oh, we have our own exotic wildlife. That is no question.
I've spent a little time during field campaigns at White Sands and over the eons, and that's an interesting place.
See, I was more imagining like working in Miami, working in Cape Canaveral, and just occasionally having to see snowbirds just with like horrible tans and Speedos. Same difference. And you mentioned the time frame of what we're going to be talking about. So like 1958, 1959, to kind of get us into it. this is obviously like immediately after the space race has just kicked off. So what is the prevailing kind of mood around this time? Are they still like freaked out? Has the space race, has the idea that America can like compete kicked in?
Well, it depends on whether, which side of the border you happen to be on. For the Soviet Union, this was an outrageous propaganda win for them. In fact, initially when they launched the original Sputnik satellite, TASS just put out just a terse little couple of paragraphs, gave the orbit, the frequencies they were transmitting on, just let it be at that. And then all of a sudden, the entire West just had a conniption, not only here in the United States, but also overseas, our allies in Europe and Asia and whatnot. All of a sudden, the United States is supposed to be the unquestioned technological leader of the world, and here's this at least the perception of the time was a backward country all of a sudden taking the lead in space and launching satellites that were tens of times larger than anything that we had on the drawing board or actually building.
Right. I guess it is also a fair point to mention. I think we covered this in some of our earlier episodes, just how massive the R7 was compared to like early American rockets. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
That, like Sputnik was 180 pounds. Sputnik 3 was something like a ton.
But closer to a ton and a half.
Jeez. Compared to Vanguard, which was the grapefruit satellite. So
yeah. In fact, it was the original Vanguard. That was the original nano satellite. That's a big thing now. Where I'm actually building nano satellites myself for my day job. So that was the original nano satellites back then.
And to think that what was supposed to be Sputnik? It was the orbital laboratory something. I cannot.
The Sputnik 3. So if I'm remembering correctly, Sputnik 3 was meant. It was Object D back then. It was meant to launch first.
When does my beloved Object D come into this?
Actually, we just passed the anniversary of that, and I have an article I had written about that. It was the first orbiting geophysical laboratory.
Yes.
An actual piece of scientific equipment.
A multimodal scientific satellite, not just...
Because Korolev was so paranoid about beating the Americans, he, made a blinky ball, which is still a huge achievement.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I think he originally, I forget what it was called in Russian, but basically it loosely translated as preliminary satellite. In other words, just something quick and easy, put it together, put a transmitter on there.
Make the Americans have a stroke.
But, it wasn't until after a couple of days after the launch of Sputnik that all of a sudden Khrushchev, who was running the show in Moscow at the time, he all of a sudden realized that this was an incredible propaganda tool. The Russians were looking for any possibilities for propaganda purposes to show how much better their system was over the American system. It was part of that global competition that was taking place during the Cold War 60 some odd years ago now. So it was at that point that they started, the Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders started thinking in terms of space spectaculars, being the first to do this, to do that. And one of the early things that they had on their list of things to do was send something to the moon.
And that covers why, like, the Soviets are going at it. Like, the moon is, I imagine to them, that's just the next big achievement, the next, like...
stepping stone.
Yeah. At the same time, there's also, like, the Americans have not really set up a full-on... Like, NASA isn't a big unified thing at this point. You still have the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army all competing.
Right. And that changed a little bit come February of 1958 with the founding of ARPA, which is Advanced Research Projects Agency. So they ended up to try to get everything under one planning umbrella. They took all the various military programs, or for instance, what was going on at ABMA with Wernher von Braun and his team and done in Alabama, as well as the U.S. Air Force and some of the Navy projects, excluding Vanguard, because at least on paper that was considered technically a civilian project. But everything else ended up being put underneath this ARPA umbrella. And the hope was, at least in the Pentagon at this stage, was that they wanted to get basically corner the whole space travel and space race for themselves, for their purposes. But things changed radically during the course of 1958. And eventually in October, we had the founding of NASA, and all of the strictly scientific R&D type of programs that ARPA had assumed under its umbrella got transferred over to newly formed NASA. And that included everything from moon probes to scientific satellites that were in the works, the Mercury, what eventually became the Mercury program, and so on. And even things as mundane as communication satellites and weather satellites all ended up going to NASA.
Kind of going off from that, so where your articles initially start off is it's still ARPA, but even though there is this central kind of organization, is there still competition between the different the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force to see who is going to wind up being like the main supplier?
Yeah, very, very much so. There was a huge competition, although probably on paper, at least, the Air Force had a better standing because they had larger rockets in the mix that were coming down. For instance, like the Atlas ICBM, which was quickly modified and used as a very capable launch vehicle for decades afterwards. But the Navy wanted to have its own systems. The Army, they with Wernher von Braun and his group at ABMA in Huntsville, they had their ambitions. They wanted to build large rockets to build bases on the moon and so on and so forth. So all of these services were out to try to outdo the other and get a piece of this thing. I think in the end, what ended up happening was the Air Force basically got tasked with taking care of most space-related things, with the other branches of the armed forces taking on very specialized tasks. For example, the early navigation satellites, that was something that was done by the Navy because that had a very specific Navy application, and things like that.
So in your articles, you talk about the initial push from the Americans to reach the moon being the United States Air Force and their 3 Pioneer probes. So this is their first attempt to reach the moon. They go straight for orbiters instead of going for flybys or an impactor. And they launch using the Thor Able rocket. Could you explain that for a second? Because with what you described of the competition, I was very curious as to why the Navy would cooperate with the Air Force to build both the Thor Able and the later Atlas Able.
Well, the Navy didn't have a monopoly on the hardware and whatnot. That hardware that was being used, for instance, in the upper stage of the second stage of the Vanguard, that was actually being built by Aerojet and whatnot. So when word came down that from up above that they needed to modify the Vanguard stage, initially it was being the Thor Able was being developed to test reentry vehicles for warheads for ICBMs and IRBMs. There was still very much come the late 50s, questions about how best to do that so you can have your nuclear warhead survive reentry and actually do its mission. So initially, the Thor Able was being designed to take care of that. But some people who wanted to be a lot more ambitious in the Air Force and also especially at the Space Technologies Laboratory, which was a division of TRW, that they ended up building a lot of the early U.S. Air Force probes. They figured that they could redesign, retailor, resize the stages, the upper stage of the Able, and combine it with the third stage, the X-248 solid rocket motor, which was being developed by Allegheny Laboratories, which was under contract by the Navy to do solid rocket motors and whatnot. They put that on, and then you'd end up with basically a launch vehicle that could put a fair payload into low Earth orbit and send 30, 40 kilograms worth of usable payload to the moon. Why they ended up going with a lunar orbiter instead of an easier lunar flyby, I think it all boils down to is, people didn't realize how tough space was at the time. So they were overly ambitious, and it certainly was an interesting goal and something that, if it had worked, they would have beaten the Soviet Union, who was at the time interested in a lunar impact mission, at least initially, for their first foray to the moon.
I think this segues very nicely to a question that I had asked Quinn yesterday, because we were briefly talking about Luna, and I told him to save it for the expert. Yeah, and so I'm here now, and I guess my curiosity is to know, why the Soviets decided on an impactor versus like something that could land safely and take samples? Like, what would have been like their main reasoning?
Well, the big reason for that is it's a lot more complicated to design a lander. Pretty early on, OKB-1 under Sergei Korolev, that design bureau, had started work on doing lunar landers and whatnot. But, it would be many, many years of development before they had their first flights in 1963, and then a series of several failures over the course of the next several years until they finally were successful with Luna 9. They just wanted to get something just really as simple and as possible that could still return some usable data. And they made no secret of the fact that what frequencies these probes were transmitting on, and they wanted people in the West with the appropriate equipment to track these things, and it would be proof by tracking the probe, its position in the sky, the changes in the Doppler shift, which of the signal that you're receiving, which gives you information about its trajectory, and ultimately you could confirm for yourself that you hit the moon, which is an interesting feat, but also it's an incredible bit of marksmanship that they're able to hit this target from 250,000 miles away. So it just kind of reinforces the whole point that the Soviet Union has an effective ICBM capability and the technology to be able to guide a warhead onto any location on the planet that it wanted to.
A large payload and pinpoint accuracy, everything you could want out of a missile.
That's right. And but also, that wasn't just what the Soviets wanted to do. The Air Force also wanted to get involved in space to do exactly the same types of things to prove to the American people and to their higher ups that, we got the technology that, look at what we can do on the moon. And, if we can do this, that means, we can protect the nation with our effective nuclear deterrent.
And you also mentioned with the accuracy point there that, correct me if I'm wrong, most of these missions were direct descent to the moon. Like they just aimed right at it. Okay.
Yeah. Basically, the stages go off one right after the other and straight to the moon.
Okay. And for our listeners, normally what you would do, like if a mission is going to the moon now, what they would do is they would reach orbit, they would circularize, and then they would do what's called a Hohmann transfer, where they stretch their orbit out by burning to go out to the moon. So this is just direct descent. This is just fire your spacecraft like a bullet at the moon and hopefully get near it or hit it.
Right, and the technique they use now is they go into a parking orbit, and then from there you can tailor when you make these reignite your upper stage again to go off to the moon or any target beyond. You got a lot more flexibility as far as your launch windows and whatnot is concerned, because if you launch a little bit late and you get into your parking orbit, well, if you're in there a little bit late, then you fire off your engines a little bit earlier and you're able to reach your target.
Man, I'm enjoying having a guest, but having a guest who is an expert also makes it kind of more difficult, because I used to be the expert and now I'm wrong on a bunch of things. This is a new experience.
But originally, the whole direct descent technique was used because it took a long time to be able to develop. In fact, it wasn't even realized that a parking orbit, first going into a parking orbit, is preferable to a direct ascent trajectory until the very, very late 1950s, when very detailed studies were being done on, well, how do we get to the moon and how do we get to the planets? And Soviet and American engineers independently discovered that the best thing to do is start off at a parking orbit. But the easiest thing to do is just fire off your rocket at the right time, aiming at the right spot in the sky, and cross your fingers that everything goes well with the ascent. There are problems with that. I mean, you got really, really small, very inflexible launch windows, because you sometimes, depending on what kind of flexibility you have, you could literally only have seconds or minutes available to get your rocket off the pad and on its way and actually meet the mission objectives. But there were also some additional problems, because the payload capability for that type of ascent is usually much, much less, because you're basically climbing more or less straight out of Earth's gravity well, as opposed to if you're in a parking orbit and then you ignite your engine to head off on an escape trajectory, you're firing towards the horizon, basically at a right angle to the force of gravity. So you're not losing a lot of effective thrust from fighting gravity to continue climbing out of the gravity well.
Right. In the document there, I made a kind of a timeline of all of the different missions, kind of like kludged all of that together. And it's a fair point you make about the windows, because they do seem to line up roughly about a month apart.
Well, yeah, because the moon has to be in the right part of the sky with the phase just right. Then you can launch.
From what I found from one of them, the U.S. Pioneer 1 and the USSR's unnamed E1 number 2, they both they launched on the same day. Like that's how inflexible those windows. Apart. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, they and that was one of those failures that we didn't get confirmed until the fall of the Soviet Union and the documents finally started being released. But it turned out that literally they were launching 15 hours behind the Pioneer, and at the time it looked as though Pioneer 1 had a very successful launch, was on its way to the moon. So they launched 15 hours later, but they'd be launching into a faster trajectory, and they'd reach the moon like a couple of hours ahead of Pioneer 1 had everything gone to plan. But unfortunately didn't. The E1 number 2, it ended up being the victim of another.
Pogoed itself to...
Yeah, literally pogoed itself apart. The 8K-73 rocket they were using with that Block E upper stage. Just a little bit too much changes in the center of gravity and how the resonant frequencies, and ended up creating the pogo problem, which took a little time for the Korolev and his team to figure out and finally resolve.
Because that pogoing issue ended up claiming, 2-3 satellites or 2 or 3 launch platforms?
For the Luna missions, it was their first 2 launch attempts. The one in September of 58, and the other one was October of 1958. So Pogo destroyed both of those, and after that, they went down for a month, missed the November launch window, and instead solved the Pogo problem, and then launched in early December. And that gave Pioneer 2 an uncontested window to give it an attempt to reach the moon in November 8th of 58.
So on the U.S. side, in the late 1958 period, you've got the U.S. Air Force launching Pioneer 0, Pioneer 1, and Pioneer 2. And all of these fail for various reasons. Either just failing to reach orbit, or like you said with Pioneer 1, failing because the third stage doesn't push it far enough.
Right.
And at the same time, you've got the Soviets with their E1 series probes, and they have 3 launches that fail due to, like you said, the first 2 are due to kind of resonance pogo problems that just shake the rockets apart. The third one is due to a peroxide pump that seizes up.
Right.
I guess, and then at that point, after Pioneer 2, the USAF program is done and kind of NASA takes over. What I wanted to ask you with Pioneer 3, the first JPL launch, was NASA already, were these organizations already kind of working in the background? Because I see that it launched on December 6th, and the last Air Force One, Pioneer 2, launched like a month before. Were they just that quick in getting it together, or were they already kind of working in parallel, expecting to take over?
They were already working in parallel. Basically, ARPA had put together a project they referred to as Operation Mona, and that included the first 3 U.S. Air Force attempts to send an orbiter into orbit around the moon, and that would be followed by the ABMA Army attempts with the what became Pioneer 3 and 4. But by this point in time, after October 1, 1958, the Pioneer program ended up being absorbed by the newly formed NASA. So while at least in the case of Pioneer 3, the project was still being run by ABMA, it was that NASA was now technically in charge of what was going on.
Gotcha. So it was just kind of a swapping of ARPA for NASA, but these groups are still doing the same thing.
Bureaucracies, as it were.
Okay. And I wanted to talk about Pioneer 3. So this is one that launches in late 1958. This is the no longer Air Force involved. It's a JPL satellite and an Army missile. And this one, the aim is to fly by the moon, but they don't reach it. And they get very far into high Earth orbit. They get like, I can't remember the exact number, but
something like 110,000 kilometers or something on that order.
And is that a partial success for them? Is there, because they seem to describe it, and the articles describe it as basically they were still able to get a lot of science done based off of that. Was that
right? Because that particular region of space had not been explored adequately. So anything from that kind of altitude was going to tell you something new. So basically, it was a consolation prize. I mean, obviously, the primary goal was to reach the moon.
And actually, this kind of, if we're going through the timeline, this actually starts a period of like 3 successive partial successes. So after Pioneer 3 fails to reach the moon but does some science, the Soviets succeed with Luna 1, or E1 number 4. So first off, I just wanted to ask, like, the Soviets, is it just for secrecy and propaganda that they only name missions if they succeed or reach orbit?
The Soviets were always reluctant to be admitting to any type of failures, so they would just not announce anything. Even although that created some issues with some of the earliest Mars and Venus probes, because they would go into a parking orbit and then they would fail to leave the parking orbit, and they would end up, the orbits would end up decaying a couple to a few days later. And technically, they were supposed to announce that they had put a payload up. So eventually what they would do is those failed missions, whether it be to the moon or Mars, Venus, or destined for wherever they were going, even in higher Earth orbits or whatever, they would just give it a Cosmos designation. And the last I checked, I think there's like over 2,500 Cosmos satellites, named satellites from the past 60 years.
And we have talked about that on separate episodes before. We did a couple of episodes on Cosmos 954, the nuclear satellite that hit Canada.
Oh, yeah. I remember it well.
Yeah, and just the idea that they hid so many different satellites, both military, scientific, or failed, within the Cosmos system, just to kind of say that they were keeping track of it, but also to kind of hide the purposes of these different satellites. But getting back to Luna, so this is the first of the E1 probes that they actually give a name to, and this is meant to hit the moon, but again, kind of partial success. They achieve the first flyby of the moon accidentally.
Yeah, they were trying to hit the moon, and basically they had the blocky upper stage that they added to the R7 ICBM to finally kick the payload into an escape trajectory. They basically, I'm trying to remember, I think it's slightly overburned. There was something had been misprogrammed or whatever the case may be. So it ended up missing the moon by, actually, it was a pretty good miss, 6,000
kilometers roundabout.
Yeah, so that's not too bad. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to get anything that close over a third of a million kilometers.
Yeah. And so the Soviets, like Luna 1, this is a big propaganda victory for them, right? Even though did they admit that it had missed, or did they say that they always wanted to fly by?
Oh, they presented it as if this was going to be their intent all the time. And they always gave something.
Nice, of course.
Yeah, they would always give some very ambiguous kind of launch announcement that, something was being launched towards the moon, or with some very, very generic, broad objectives, without actually saying, "Oh, this was meant to actually hit the moon" or anything like that. So, like later on, when Luna 2 was a success, of course they were, once it hit, it was saying, "Oh yeah, we meant to do that all along."
This reminds me of that thing that cats do when they're walking on something they shouldn't, and then they inevitably fall down, and then they land, and they just act all cool about it.
I meant to do that.
It's always easier to shift the goalposts when no one else with the goalposts were in the first place.
Yeah,
that's right. But it's still, I mean, it was quite the achievement.
Oh, no, the achievement is not to be detracted from the slightest.
Oh, yeah.
And I do have to ask, because on our show, we've run into it a whole bunch of times, of the trend in Soviet politics and in space history of, wouldn't it be nice if we had something for the holidays? I noticed that Luna 1 launched on January 2nd, very close to New Year's. which is very big in the Soviet and post-Soviet world. It's probably just because of the window, but I do want to ask, was there, with the Luna program, was there political pressure from Soviet higher-ups to, like, get this done, do it quick?
Well, on these very earliest missions, you really didn't have much flexibility as far as your launch window was concerned. I mean, there was certainly a propaganda value no matter when it launched and whatnot. But I mean, if you're going to launch, if your launch window only exists on January 2nd, you're launching on January 2nd. You're not going to move it up or back to just to coincide conveniently with some political holiday.
Okay.
It makes sense. We had to ask. It's like contractually obligated that we try and find those moments.
Well, there were certainly plenty of those types of moments during the course of, especially early Soviet, the early Soviet space program. But my feeling is that was the earliest lunar project, the first lunar missions. They were largely immune to that, other than the capability of just being able to do that.
It was serendipity. Right. They matched up on date.
Right.
Yeah, so before we get on to the next kind of NASA Pioneer probe, Pioneer 4, I did want to ask, so a big thing with the Soviets is that the R7, correct me if I'm wrong, the R7 rocket, like, it didn't have an upper stage. The earlier one that launched, like Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, Sputnik 3, it just put the entire booster stage without the side boosters in orbit.
It basically consisted of, it used a technique of what they call parallel staging, where basically the core and the four tapered boosters that they have around the base, they all ignite on the pad, and the thing doesn't lift off until all the engines have been ignited, and you go straight into orbit. The Atlas, the U.S. Air Force Atlas, used a similar technique because they had the same problem. No one had ignited large rocket engines at high altitude before, and there definitely would be some issues. So again, the Atlas ignited a pair of boosters and a sustainer engine at liftoff, and at some point during its flight, it would jettison the booster engines and its supporting structure with the sustainer carrying the rocket for the rest of the journey.
Right, and the Atlas was a very interesting one because it had a single tank. It has a single fuel tank, an oxidizer tank.
Right, they made use of like these balloon tanks, as they called them, where basically you had stainless steel that's probably about a millimeter thick or so, and they use gas pressure basically to keep the structure rigid.
God.
And then it would have, and then I might be thinking, yeah, I believe it's the Atlas, but it dropped it dropped extra engines instead of dropping entire extra stages. It had the kind of flared.
They would just drop the booster engines and the supporting structure to help lighten the rocket so it could achieve its objectives, whether it was being used as a ICBM or as a satellite launch vehicle.
Is there a specific name for that style of staging, whereby you have the stage and a half or something like that?
Well, in the case of the Atlas, that's commonly referred to as a stage and a half type of situation. Okay. But with the R7 ICBM, that was a case that we call it's called parallel staging.
So it was just okay.
Yeah.
So the question I wanted to segue to was, which again, I guess I could probably make an educated assumption based off of the answer to the last question, was why was it that the Soviets ultimately preferred to design the R7 with the parallel configuration instead of like a multi-stage? And I'm going to assume that it was less complex to do so.
It was less complex, but it didn't take long to realize that the R7 was not going to make the best kind of ICBM. I mean, it was in service for a number of years. In fact, a lot of there was a whole wing of them that was ready to go come the crisis in Cuba.
Oh, Lord.
1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, they were using, but even by this particular stage, no pun intended, OKB-1 and the other Soviet design bureaus were looking at a more conventional two-stage rocket design with basically a proper second stage that would ignite at altitude.
Because ultimately, in the end, because I'm parallel side by side, and logical assumption is serial is one on top of the other. Serial is what works for silos.
Yep.
But as you're talking about, the unknown complexities at that time of igniting a liquid rocket in extremely high altitude / zero atmosphere.
Right, which is one of the reasons ultimately Korolev had to get beyond that. Because with the launch of the Sputnik 3, he had already reached the limits of what could be done with that particular rocket. Actually, Sputnik 3 was launched using a specifically designed version of the R7 rocket that was from the start designed to launch satellites. So it had been stripped down, and it's the performance of its stages tailored to for a satellite launch mission.
Okay.
But you can only launch like about 1.5 tons into low Earth orbit using that configuration. So he wanted to have he knew he needed an upper stage, and that was the beginnings of the origins of the Block E stage that they added and made the 8K-72 rocket. So it had the capability of launching 300 to 400 kilograms worth of payload towards the moon, or on the order of about 5 tons or so into low Earth orbit, which made it easy to take and adapt that into the Vostok launch vehicle.
Yeah, that is a colossal increase in what would in ICBM terms be throwaway.
And you mentioned the 8K-72, but they also started working on at the same time the 8K-73. So can you explain why they went with these two kind of competing designs, the more conservative 72 and the more advanced 73?
Well, I think it comes down to exactly what you said. One's more conservative and one's a bit more advanced, would take a bit more development. In the case of the 8K-72, its Block E upper stage, it was making use of a modified version of one of the steering rockets that was used on the RD-107-108 engine combination that was used on the R7 ICBM and later satellite launch vehicles. So start off with that, make some modifications, build a basic structure, and bingo, you got yourself a relatively simple and robust upper stage. Now there was. Well, that was a good interim step. It was foreseen that there'd be even the need to launch even heavier payloads, not just towards the moon, but also towards the planets, because even at this early stage in 1958-59 timeframe, Korolev and his team were already looking into launching probes to Mars and Venus, which they finally did in 1960. But originally the intent was to use this larger 8K-73 with a specially designed RD-109 rocket engine. But ultimately, the development of the rocket engine took a lot longer than anticipated, and the whole thing was eventually just scrapped, especially since the Block E would have the performance that was necessary to, at least for the first moon probes and the first Vostok missions that were then being envisioned. Ultimately, they, as we were mentioning earlier, we were talking about parking orbits and whatnot. The Soviet scientists and engineers independently came up with the same idea that it's actually better to place your payload into a parking orbit and then wait to reignite your upper stage until you were just in the right spot to get you to where you were going. And in any case, they ended up developing a totally new rocket for that, which eventually evolved into the Molnaya launch vehicle, which also serves as the basis of the Soyuz launch vehicle, whose descendants are still being flown today by Russia.
Yeah, and that's like an important step along the evolutionary journey of the R7 all the way to like the Soyuz -2M whatever they're at now.
I think they're up to like 2.1A or something like that. I'm losing track of all the designations.
They're going to 0.0 designations. That's just they're trying to get in on like the kind of modern techie movement.
Oh, the granularity.
Yeah, making it sound like it's in beta or something. So getting back to kind of the NASA side, E1 number 4 misses the moon by 6,000 kilometers and it becomes the first flyby. And a couple of months later, NASA retries with Pioneer 4. This one also flies by, but it misses by a much bigger margin.
Oh, something like 30,000 kilometers. I mean, It's a very wide miss.
And is this still kind of equally as useful as Luna 1? Like, even though the altitudes are different, as far as just like.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, this is totally unexplored space. So any information you get out from that area, it's something that's new and it's something that's useful. So it didn't meet its objectives, being able to do a relatively close flyby. because it was carrying a engineering experiment with a camera trigger on board to basically serve as a test of that. But they were far too far away from the moon during the flyby for that triggering device to actually activate.
Okay, so it was actually like, it was, I guess, gravity activated?
No, what it was light activated. It would use the light of the moon as it was passing through the field of view of the sensor to activate. Originally, the Army pioneers, the original intent was to carry like a very, very simple camera with a single frame of film on it and take a picture, develop it on board, and then transmit the results back, which was way too over ambitious. And in the end, they ended up doing the just a simple space radiation package to get a better understanding of what was going on with the space radiation environment, which was, again, completely brand new. They didn't understand what was going on. Their expectations of what to expect once you got into space were completely and totally trash when they discovered things like the Van Allen radiation belts and so on.
And yeah, both of these, as you mentioned, after doing their flybys with the kind of scientific utility of them, they also fly clean out. They escape Earth and they wind up in heliocentric.
Right. Become the first artificial planets, as they were called back then.
I can totally see a Soviet press release hailing Luna 1 as the first Soviet planet.
In fact, that's exactly what they did.
Oh my God. We've gotten too good at this, guys, or they've gotten too predictable. And yeah, so that gets us through the kind of early, so both NASA and the Soviets have made flybys at this point. So the Soviets, and that's like, this is early 1959, and then it's about, I'd say like, it's a couple of months, the Soviets make another attempt. The Soviets redesign the E1 probe, and can you briefly explain the differences, if any, between the E1 and the E1A probes?
Right. The big difference between the E1 and the E1A is basically, if you look close at pictures of comparing the two side by side, it's basically the antenna housing. The design of the antenna housing was altered, and there were also some changes made to some of the electronics because they were having problems receiving the signal because of interference from onboard instruments and whatnot. The gain of the antenna wasn't quite what they expected. The signal was weaker, so they basically upgraded the communications and made some modest improvements to some of the other systems based on the flight experience to come up with E1A, which, again, was being directed towards a lunar impact.
So very much like an evolutionary step, not a radical redesign.
Absolutely. Evolutionary, which is something that the Soviets were very, very good at. They would basically fly something until, find out what went wrong. Why didn't it go? Okay, go back, make a few modifications, and then
the
try
R7,
it again.
The Soyuz spacecraft.
Right. Now, that's a technique that they had actually developed for their aircraft industry and whatnot. And that worked fine usually because more often than not, even if something goes wrong with the plane, you get the plane and the pilot back so you can figure it out. But in the case of space, once the rocket's off the pad, that's it. It's gone.
You've lit the rocket. Good luck.
Yeah, it's so that which explains a lot of the early failures in the Soviet space program, and even today. They very much rely on flight experience in order to take and modify their spacecraft and make modest improvements to resolve problems. Which, for example, is one of the reasons why their Venus program ultimately became so successful, was because of these incremental improvements that were made over time until finally they were actually getting Venus probes to get to the surface and survive.
Yeah, I think it was like the late Venera 6, 7, 8, like kind of the late 10 area where they finally started succeeding.
Yeah, the first one would have been Venera 7 in, was that 1969 or 1970? I'm trying to remember now. I'd have to look it up.
I don't remember where I heard it, but wasn't the Venera was the Soviet probe that they sent to Venus that like landed on Venus, right?
Ultimately, yeah.
Wasn't the original mission design that it was going to like deploy a balloon and float in the atmosphere?
Not originally, no. There was the balloon payload that actually there was a joint effort between the Soviet space program and the French space project, CNES. they were cooperating on a balloon payload that one of the Venera spacecraft would bring to Venus to actually float in the atmosphere of Venus for a number of days. And that would have been sometime in the mid-1980s. Eventually, that mission evolved into the Vega mission, which flew by Venus, dropped off some landers and balloons, and then continued on to make close-up observations of Comet Halley in March of 1986. But the issue there was that as a result of the change in the mission, the balloon payload had to shrink. The spacecraft, they wouldn't go into orbit, so they couldn't be in orbit to support the taking data from the balloon payload. So ultimately, the French just bailed from the project, and the Soviets instead designed their own balloon payload. So that actually, yeah. So that was the mid 1980s, not one of their early things. Early on, they were trying to get all the way to the surface, obviously for the prestige of being able to make the first landing on another planet, which ultimately they did in 1970 with the Venera 7.
It's a good thing you mentioned making it to the surface, because that I want to segue that into our next, back on the lunar side. So by around the end of 1959 in September, the Soviets finally succeed in hitting the moon with Luna 2. And this brings me to a question that I absolutely know from yesterday that other Chris was begging to ask.
Yes, shrapnel bombing the moon.
Yes, with a bunch of little medallions glorifying Lenin and the Soviet Union.
I do have to say they're very aesthetically pleasing. But
they are pretty. I've seen replicas. They are actually very nice.
Yeah, the first instinct was to have them hit the moon at, I'm assuming, Mach 20 plus.
About 3 kilometers per second.
Oh.
A hilarious velocity that's going to completely deform all of those metals.
Now that you bring up the metal bomb again, it made me think about, what if, whenever we're there on the moon again, by some miracle, one of them has managed to survive. It's just possibly just slightly buried in the lunar dirt.
Those are going to be so valuable.
And it's going to be so valuable, like one that's at least just only partially deformed, right? Or even we find one that just somehow miraculously is in pristine condition. It just imagine it would just I just think it's just so funny, because it's just again, the quote hilarious speeds at which the probe impacted the lunar surface.
Well, but think about this, though. I mean, that would serve the original purpose of having those medallions. If we, sometime in the next couple of decades, somebody stumbles upon the impact crater of Luna 2, and it's well, is this Luna 2 or is this something up? And they sift through the debris and they find one of those medallions. Right. The Soviet Union, almost a century after the fact, would once again be in the news, and we'd be talking all about it. Propaganda value, decades down the road.
Sergei Korolev was here.
The disembodied spirit of the supranational entity will be rolling in its grave.
Exactly. It was done strictly for propaganda value, that if anyone at some point in time in the future were to find that, they would know this is proof that the Soviet Union was the first to reach the moon.
And yeah, Chris, you do have a good point, because the first instinct nowadays would be to sell them, to, throw them into the capitalist system and make a lot of money on eBay with them.
I just think it would be a priceless piece to have in a museum,
Ultimately, a Soviet artifact to be sold into the capitalist system for a profit.
Yes, the irony would be just incredible.
Lenin could be hooked up to a generator in his grave and power all of Moscow.
But then this does also kind of tie into, with our episodes and with all of these stories, we have to come to the conclusion that Sergei Korolev had kind of the ability to recognize the propaganda value that a lot of people didn't. He understood, we talked about in some of our episodes that he picked Sputnik to be spherical because he wanted it to be seen. He put reflectors on the R7 rockets so that they could be seen in the night sky. You do kind of get the sense that putting propaganda bombs on a lunar impactor does fits his MO, I think.
He was also very much I was about to say, a child of his time, but actually maybe more of a victim of his time. I mean, he grew up because he ended up spending time in a gulag and whatnot, because during the the Stalin era and whatnot. He had a really rough life, which really affected his health down the road, which is probably one of the reasons why he died so young. But he knew that in order to get ahead, that he had to toe the party line, and that everything that was being done for the glory of the Soviet Union and so on. I mean, that's how you got ahead in that system. So, of course, there was an implied propaganda value to anything he may be doing. But like I said, he was just, a product of his time.
I think I've seen a lot of biographies, write-ups on his life that he wasn't necessarily a genius engineer or scientist the way you might talk about someone like von Braun, but he was a very effective manager and political kind of animal.
Exactly. And that's even true here in the United States. I've been involved with more than my fair share of space projects. And you have to make sure that whoever's at the top of your org chart, that particular person is very adept politically, navigating what's going on in Congress, what's going on in the Pentagon, what's going on with the contractors, trying to build a consensus that, you've got to do this, otherwise, the world's going to end. Of course, those tactics don't always work. One of my projects that I'm most proud of was the Ramos project, the Russian-American observation satellite project. The weather satellites that I'm currently developing was actually an outgrowth of some of the technology we developed during that project, where we'd use pairs of satellites to make observations of the atmosphere at wavelengths from the thermal infrared through the visible all the way into the ultraviolet. But ultimately, after spending about $200 some odd million on the project, the Defense Department decided that we're just going to cancel this. That we're not going to do it, and that was the end of it. So I've been at the receiving end of having canceled projects more than once, which is another reason why I like being in the private sector now. I think it's a lot easier to deal with venture capitalists than it is with bureaucrats at the Pentagon.
Okay, wait, I had a question before I forget. If I'm allowed to ask, why are the satellites in pairs?
In order to do simultaneous stereo. I mean, there's been lots of work, and I've done it myself in my work on the space station, where you in order to do a stereo observation, you got to have pictures taken from two different locations, just like you have two eyes on your head, at least most of us do. And that's how we see in 3D. But if you're looking at, topography, mountains, the terrain or whatever, that doesn't move. So that's, you could get away using what they call this pseudo stereo technique. The clouds are moving. So in the time it takes you to move from one spot to another, the clouds are going to be moving. So you're going to be conflating motions of clouds with parallax in order to determine the altitude. So the way around that is you have a pair of satellites making observations simultaneously from two different locations. And to the best of my knowledge, it's never been done.
I'm going to have to do some more reading on that. I'll definitely be reading those links, because one of my professors in university who taught all of the orbital mechanics, that kind of stuff, his big thing that he tried to impart on us was spacecraft formation flying. Something that definitely hasn't been done a whole lot.
Yeah, we're going to be attempting to do that with basically 6U CubeSats.
Jeez. And like what kind of separation between these units?
On the order of about 300 kilometers.
Okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't need to be very exact. We just need to know where they are relative to each other in order to do our 3D reconstructions of the scenes.
Okay.
Also, Drew, thank you for humoring my sidetrack question.
I've been giving this lecture for the past decade now.
Another answer I would have accepted was that every satellite needs a buddy.
There's also that. There is also that. There are too many lonely satellites up there right now. Well, except for Starlink.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and there's going to be so many more constellations soon. That's going to be part of me, a little bit just kind of one. I know they have all kinds of tracking. I know that there are ways of doing it safely, that there aren't, big risks.
You're worried about dollar store Kessler.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's always in the back of my mind.
And my fear is we'll finally reach that particular state just in time for, my constellation to get into orbit and then be basically ground down to dust in a matter of days.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Actually, that does bring something up. Something that we, was it the E-1A or the E-2A satellites on the Soviet side that released a kind of puff of gas as they were flying out to the moon?
Yes. I think it was both E1 and the E2 that did release basically sodium. Actually, during part of my career doing defense stuff, we did a lot of stuff with sounding rockets, and we'd release metals and whatnot at very, very high altitude, and we'd use the yeah, I can talk about this. Basically, we would use the results of how these metals would ionize under the ultraviolet of the sun and whatnot in order to then turn around and verify predictions of nuclear effects of when you detonate a nuclear bomb at high altitude.
Holy.
Ooh.
So anyway, it was very, very common during this time, and even today, to release clouds of metallic vapor and then observe how the cloud behaves under solar radiation, the effects of magnetic fields, and things like that in order to infer information about what's going on. In the case of these early lunar probes, they were doing it basically because it was highly visible. It's something that if you were at the right place at the right time and you knew where to look with an appropriately sized telescope, you could see it, which would give independent confirmation of what was going on.
Man, wow. I love when science just involves nuclear explosions. It's just like having the guys that want to test stuff and find stuff out, and it's just like they're doing it involving the angriest thing that humanity has ever created.
A lot of the people I've worked with and still work with today, they actually got their starts in the nuclear effects stuff, and some of them. One of them, and I'm going to give him a shout out because I'm hoping he's going to listen to this, and this will make it into the edit. I'm trying to get some bonus points there. But anyway, is Dr. A.T. Stair, who's the CEO of Tropical Weather Analytics. He originally, and a lot of other colleagues of mine, but he's still with us. He's in his early 90s, and he got his start back in the late 50s when they still were doing actual nuclear tests at high altitude.
Oh, so the heyday of atomic. Oh.
And I remember getting to see some of that footage. A lot of it's declassified now, but I remember actually getting to see some of that footage eons ago when it was still very much classified. And it's just amazing and horrifying at the same time.
Yeah.
It's almost a beauty and annihilation kind of thing.
Yeah. And especially as a physicist, looking at, what's going on, seeing how all the radiation diffuses and what it does to the upper atmosphere. It's incredible.
And then, you're looking at it as a professional, noticing all of the academic and the physics related effects. And then the reptile in the back of your head is just also remembering this is deadly. This is dangerous. Run.
Oh, yes, very much so. Very much so.
This will turn my DNA into Swiss cheese.
And I don't want to spoil a whole lot for the Chris's here, but that did remind me, if you'd ever heard of, I think it was Project Argus, the plan to intercept ballistic missiles by building a radiation death kind of parasol over the U.S.
I've actually been wanting to write an article about Project Argus.
Oh, okay.
Wait, something?
I spoiled too much for them. But
I'm sorry, I must ask though. It almost sounds like in terms of just regular chemical explosives, something like a sympathetic detonation kind of scenario.
It was less, there's, with a lot of intercepting missiles, there's been the idea of just get a nuke vaguely near it and just blow it up.
Hit to kill or kill it through.
Yeah, and whenever guidance systems weren't that good back then, a nuke would be your assurance of, just get within a mile of it and you're good. This idea for Project Argus, my cat's here, without getting too much into it, was basically that instead of detonating a nuke in order to directly destroy a Soviet missile, it was if you detonate a nuke at the right altitude and the right place, the radiation would stay, the Earth's magnetic field would contain the ion cloud, and you could build a kind of hovering radiation cloud over the US. And the idea was that it would EMP anything that came through it.
Oh, sweet.
And it would slowly dissipate over time, but you would just top it up by firing more nukes into it. I have dragged us off topic again, like we talked about. I do my best work whenever I am either excited to inflict a story on my friends or angry about something.
Yeah, and the lizard brain is scared because the most I ever heard about nukes being used to intercept nukes was going all the way back to the Sprint system.
So to get us back kind of on track with the first moon race and the Soviets specifically, they developed the E-2A series of satellites. And they launched the first one in late 1959, and this is Luna 3. And
actually, they had launched one as early as June, which unfortunately didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, let me double check that. Did they actually launch it? Yes.
I think
153 seconds into the mission, the gyro horizon of the rocket's guidance system failed. So that would have been E1A number 5.
Okay. I thought that was an E1. I guess I had it miswritten. I had that written as the first E1A satellite.
Yeah, that would have been the first E1A, was the one that was launched on June 16th of 59. And then there was the second one. That was the successful one. That was the quote-unquote second cosmic rocket, which was launched in September. That became
Wipe
Luna
the
2.
other ones under the rug, yeah. And then, but the E2, correct me if I'm wrong, the E2A is a completely different kind of build of satellite, like a new bus.
Right, much more advanced, probably the most advanced spacecraft of its day.
And its goal was to take pictures. It was to fly by the moon instead of impacting it and take pictures of the dark side of the moon.
Oh, we like to call it the far side now. Calling it the dark side just causes so much trouble.
Because it's not always dark, the sun.
Well, that's a specious argument anyway, because that's not the original meaning of the word dark side of the moon. It was dark like in that it was hidden.
Unknown?
It was hidden from view. It was unknown, unexplored. Kind of like the same thing, like keeping somebody in the dark. You're keeping information from somebody, or Darkest Africa, which was a nice term to be using over a century ago to refer to those parts of Africa which hadn't been explored by European explorers yet. So
okay,
anyway,
so the far side of the moon.
The far
We'll
side.
be sticking with that from now on. But you make the point in your articles of something very interesting, which is that the film, that the Soviets didn't have the right kind of film to take pictures of the moon, and they found it from a very interesting source, which was the CIA.
That's right.
The CIA inadvertently helping the Russian space program.
And can you briefly explain how that kind of chain of events happened for us?
Well, basically, the Soviet engineers needed a radiation-resistant film in order to go to the moon. The film that they had available would become too fogged by the radiation that we were expecting in the cislunar environment. So what they ended up doing was they ended up using film that had been scavenged from downed spy balloons put out by the CIA. It was Weapons System 119L, Project Genetrix, I think is how it's pronounced.
Yes.
Genetrix? That sounds right. So anyway, during the course of the late 1950s, the American government, the U.S. Air Force, and CIA basically launched hundreds of these balloons to float over the Soviet Union and take images as they went across at high altitudes, like 30 to 60,000 feet. Most of the balloons never were recovered. A lot of them ended up being downed or coming down on their own in Soviet territory. Of course, there was a huge to-do about that in diplomatic circles, just like there's a huge to-do about the Chinese balloons flying over American airspace today. Mm-hmm. But in any case, they were able to recover more than enough film from these downed reconnaissance balloons to be able to scavenge enough to actually load up their automated camera systems on board the Luna 3, the E2A imaging system.
Wow. And I have to ask, because I've heard similar stories of how these kind of programs work. Like, was the Kremlin aware that it was launching with American film in it, or was this something that the scientists just kind of put in and didn't tell anyone?
Well, it certainly wasn't anything that came out until, gee whiz, I didn't hear about it for the first time. It was like the late 90s or something like that. So,
so this was like even later declassification than normal.
Yeah. So, geez, I mean, Weapon System 119L, I don't think that was declassified until the 90s either. So, but in any case, I'm sure those kind of details were left out. I wouldn't be wanting to report that to my superiors.
Yeah, just tell them, like, I sorted it out. I found the film. Never mind the English written on it.
Actually, I think originally they started with, I think that those balloons were using 70 millimeter format film. So basically what they would do is they built a process that they would strip the 70 millimeter film down to 35 millimeter, which was ultimately used in the E2A. and then give it the perforation that they required.
Oh, that's just physically chopping up the CIA film to make it fit in my satellite is the perfect Soviet engineering.
Yeah, I just love how it's so consistent in like all of these space missions with the Soviets, is that like they have a mission and it just feels like like the sense that I get is just that like a lot of the times it's like one of those like, oops, I procrastinated until the day before the project is due. What do we do? Oh, I have this film we looted from these down balloons. That will work.
But then I think we also have to be fair because they're getting it done. Because
they're adapting
like we talked about, like the initial American counter to the R7 was Vanguard, which was this horribly over-engineered like semi-civilian project that dealt with like a bunch of where every single part was a different contractor.
It was a Frankenstein rocket.
And very much a bear to manage.
Oh, just like at the same time, yeah, we can make fun of the using the CIA film, but it fell into their lap.
It's to me, it's I'm just like left with the thought of like the procrastination kid versus the my dog ate my homework kid.
Like if we're looking at the timeline, Luna 2, so the first probe to hit the moon happened on September 12th, 1959. Luna 3 launches less than a month later. Like it launches on October 4th. So as far as modern space missions go, this is an incredibly rapid tempo for these things.
And all of them launched late as well. And that's something that happened on the Soviet side and on the American side. There would be plans made that, we're going to make this launch on, in January of 1959. And they'd be lucky if they get it up in January of 1960. Things always ended up taking much longer because everything was new.
Just plowing through the unknown to try and hit the objective when the objective is still not necessarily nebulous, but the road to it is nebulous.
With the E2A, with Luna 3, and we get these, I don't have any pictures right here with me, but we get these pretty good pictures of the far side of the moon, which frankly, compared to our side, is pretty boring. There's not a whole lot to see. But I imagine, like, for the Soviets, this is huge propaganda value, right?
Absolutely.
I have a couple of notes here on, like, the Pioneer P1 and the Pioneer P3 missions. Both, like, the entire Pioneer P series kind of fails. I think P5 maybe succeeds.
P5, that would have, it ended up being Pioneer 5. I forgot what its P designation. Actually, I think it might have been P1. But the Pioneer orbiters that followed.
The Atlas Able ones.
The original ABMA missions, the Pioneer 3 and 4 missions. Those in 1959 and 1960, there were a total of 3 launch attempts and none of them worked. But this was, again, a really advanced spacecraft. It was built by TRW, actually the Space Technology Laboratory at TRW, the same who made the other paddle wheel, what they call the paddle wheel probes, like Pioneer 5, Explorer 6, and whatnot. That's the same outfit that also built the original U.S. Air Force orbiters as part of Operation Mona back in 1958.
So you mentioned that paddle wheel design. More so just out of my curiosity, was that kind of the standard bus for American satellites of that period?
I think it'd be more appropriate to call that the standard bus for Space Technology Laboratory built satellites. That's what they came up upon. It was a simple shape. It was spin stabilized. The paddle wheels, they had the solar panels out on these what they call paddle wheels that were angled that maximized the amount of light those panels would get, no matter what the orientation was of the satellite. So that became became the standard, at least for the Space Technology Laboratory, for those early U.S. Air Force projects, which NASA ended up adopting in October of '58.
And I might have the wrong impression here. It seemed to me that after those P1, P3, P5, P30 missions, that like NASA seemed to shift its focus away from the moon. They seemed to give up on landing because it would be a bunch of years later with like the Rangers that they would go back to orbit and like land on the moon.
I don't think that's a fair assessment, because what happened was, by the time the last of the P3 series paddle wheel lunar orbiters after that had run its course with no successes, it was in January of 1960 that JPL got the task of building Ranger, and by May of 1960, they got the go ahead to start work on developing Surveyor, which at the time was a two-pronged project. One part was to land on the surface of the moon. The other was to go into lunar orbit and to start mapping of potential landing sites from orbit. Ultimately, by 1963, things were going poorly for JPL with the Ranger program failures and so on. So that ended up being spun off to Langley Research Center as a lunar orbiter.
I do agree. I think I gave a kind of a bad read of it there, that it definitely wasn't them giving up.
Yeah, literally the year after the Ranger program was approved for development, it was the following year that the first Block 1 prototypes of the Ranger were, well, they attempted to launch them, and they ended up getting stuck in their parking orbits as opposed to going into deep space as they were supposed to. But they were very much actively working on that project to go to the moon. And in 1962, they had the 3 Block 2 missions, which all 3 ended up being failures.
Like, I'm seeing here that they impacted a lot of the, like, were they trying to soft land?
The Block 2 Rangers, as opposed to the later Block 3 Rangers, which actually ended up being successful, at least the last 3 of them. The Block 2 Rangers basically they had 3 main objectives. One was to take television images as they approached for impact with just one very primitive television camera. They also had a gamma ray spectrometer that they would use to detect the radiation coming off the surface of the moon in order to get some estimate of how much uranium and thorium and potassium-40 there is in the upper layers of the lunar surface. But they also carried a hard lander, which had its own retro rocket that was supposed to land a seismometer on the surface of the moon that would then operate for the next month or 2 or 3.
And then it would detect other Ranger missions that would impact close enough to.
Yep, but you'd be able to do things like that, for example, or other missions that would end up crashing. But if it lasted long enough. The first mission, it suffered from a launch vehicle failure, and it was basically thrown very wide of the moon and wasn't able to impact the moon. It didn't have the Delta V capability for a mid-course correction to impact the moon. The other 2, they both impacted the moon, but not in the way that they were supposed to.
Was the camera not pointed the right way, or
no? And this particular case is, I think it's I'm trying to remember what the failures were. In the case of Ranger 5, the onboard clock stopped operating, and all of the electromechanical gadgetry that coordinated what was done and how commands were sent out to various systems, that just failed to work. So it basically was dead, and it was tracked using the radio beacon on the lander it ultimately ended up impacting on the far side of the moon. And the next one, Ranger 5, that ended up shortly after it deployed its solar panels. They shorted out, robbed the spacecraft of energy, and again, the thing died en route and was tracked using the radio beacon on the lander to observe its impact on the moon. Anyway, as a result of that, there were a bunch of changes that were then made to the Block 3, which everyone tends to be more familiar with, where its mission was strictly impact photography. It was equipped with 4, or was it 6? Now I'm trying to remember, but a whole bunch of television cameras, including a couple that would be darn close to today's high def standards. So really, yeah.
And the transmission was such that we would be getting all of that quality
right,
back
and all
here.
This stuff was being transmitted with a 60-watt transmitter and a big dish antenna back to the Earth using analog. This was the pre-digital age in this particular case, so analog signals were being picked up of the live transmissions as these things screamed into the lunar surface.
I'm looking at a picture now, and for any listeners or viewers on YouTube, I'll have a picture up for them as well. But yeah, like the high gain antenna on this thing is massive compared to the size of the spacecraft.
Yeah, they had a really meaty antenna in order to get that, and a powerful transmitter too. That the transmitter only had to operate for less than a half an hour anyway. So, but not often you see 60-watt transmitters on board spacecraft of that era.
So that kind of covers past 1960. That covers a good chunk of the American kind of continuing progress towards reaching and landing on the moon. So the Ranger program, the Surveyor program. Talking briefly about the Soviets and how their program succeeded past 1960. You've got basically, and I don't have the timeline up here, but it seems like a lot of repeated failures over 7 years before finally Luna 9 is able to like soft land.
Right.
So the Soviets, they knew, like the Americans announced beforehand what their launches were going to be, what rocket was going to be launching when. Did NASA have a good idea of when the Soviets were launching, even if they weren't publicizing it? Or was their security apparatus kind of effective at keeping stuff secret?
For the most part, things were kept secret. There was definitely no public announcements, and you'd end up with the occasional failure that would get stranded in parking orbit, and it didn't take too much work to figure out that, oh, this thing is a failed Mars probe or Venus probe or Moon probe, because these are the launch windows. But there was also a lot of, I would assume, some human intelligence, but also a lot of electronic intelligence going back to the late 1950s. U.S. intelligence was well aware of when there were failures and whatnot. A lot of that information leaked out during the course of the 60s with there were a whole bunch of dates of possible lunar probe launches and failures, some of which panned out. Others were just plain wrong. Now that we got the actual record so that we know what was going on and when, we actually have been able to piece that all together, which I've tried to do in my series of articles about the E6 Luna landers that the Soviets were launching in the mid-60s.
I guess, is there anything else that you would like to bring up as far as these missions, as far as the early space race kind of history?
Oh, I think that basically what was going on is just a sign of the desperation, especially on the American side, of trying to get anything up. There was definitely a public perception issue here that somehow the Soviet Union was far in advance of us, and that became one of the big political issues during the 1960 presidential election was the missile gap, which we already knew by that point in time there was no missile gap. We had the Soviet Union actually had very few operational ICBMs and these big Kluge R7s, but still, I mean, it's something that I don't think anybody has appreciation for today. There's a certain mix of excitement about trying to do something that no one else had ever done ever in human history, and being just scared that somebody else was going to beat you to it, make you look bad.
The American exceptionalism got a little bruised that day.
Oh, absolutely. And it really wasn't until the mid-60s that whole image finally started going away. We started having a series of very successful, the later Ranger missions, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter, the Mariner missions to Mars and Venus. The Gemini missions, definitely, at least as far as crewed space flight is concerned. The Gemini program, by the time they got to the Gemini 6 and 7, those flights where they were rendezvousing in space and had people stay up for an entire fortnight in orbit, which I can't imagine doing inside of one of those things. But it was by that point that I think the United States not only hit its stride, at least as far as the perception worldwide, but I think in reality was really hitting their stride and just beating the Soviet Union. And that wouldn't become apparent until, decades later, looking back at the full historical record of what was going on and just seeing, how far ahead we ended up getting so early.
Yeah, and we actually covered this pretty recently. Our last couple of episodes were on Soyuz 1 and Vladimir Komarov. Right. And I think a lot of people kind of have that perception that America was behind right up until Apollo 11 happened. And then they blew past at the last minute, like sprinting past, when it seems like, the Soviets fell behind pretty quick midway through the 60s, where...
Oh, absolutely.
like there were 10 Gemini missions and the Soviets only launched 2 Voskhod missions. And then they waited 2 years before launching a Soyuz. And then they had to wait a year and a half because of the failure of Soyuz 1. Just kind of like the Soviets seem to have pretty quickly fallen off the space race.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of that was two-pronged. One of it was that the United States just had more resources available and marshaled those resources in a coordinated way much more quickly than the Soviet Union did. There was still a lot of competition going on through the 1960s between OKB-1 and other rival design bureaus about, whose moon program is the one that's going to actually be developed and whatnot.
Chelomey, I think.
Yeah, and they just never got the support that they required. And then, of course, the passing of Sergei Korolev in 1966. I mean, that's something that only if we had a time machine or something, go back and look at alternate histories, I still feel that was a huge blow to the advancement of the Soviet lunar ambitions.
Oh yeah, especially when you consider like what was his name, Vladimir Mishin, the guy who came after and didn't seem to have all of the qualities of Korolev.
And also, in fairness to Mishin as well, I mean, things were spiraling out of control in terms of how huge the enterprise had become. I mean, these things are huge, and to have just one person in charge of something like this, you got to have very special managerial skills. And that was actually part of the problem that JPL had to deal with, was how do you properly manage these early lunar programs, because they were just just riddled with failures, one after another. And management techniques had to be developed in order to design, build, and operate these things and ensure there be a high degree of high probability of success.
And this is actually going back a bit. I wanted to make this note. I will, whenever you said Gemini 7, I will edit in kind of the gamer air horn noise, because on our show, we are unreasonably obsessed with the Gemini 7 mission. And just how
I've written a couple of articles about it. So there you go.
Yeah, we sourced your articles. Our particular favorite is midway through one of your Gemini 7 articles is a picture of Frank Borman looking incredibly angry.
Yes.
The most annoyed a human being has ever been on like day 10 of his mission.
And he's still got 4 days to go.
Yeah.
The amount of annoyance that Frank Borman was subjected to throughout the course of that mission.
Oh,
he is my hero.
What I still find remarkable is that just a couple of years after that mission, Lovell and Borman ended up being on the Apollo 8 mission to the moon.
Oh no.
I mean, it must have been just so boring, because, I mean, those guys, during the course of training and spending 2 weeks in space, must have shared every single story that they have. Everything. What else are you going to talk about, spending the better part of 10 days going to the moon and back?
Oh yeah. Well, imagine being the third crew member of Apollo 8, where you're not part of the inside jokes.
Yeah.
The other two guys have their friendship, and you feel kind of excluded.
Well, almost. I think it is pretty close to say stewing in that capsule.
Just it smells constantly. You have horrible dandruff. You're only allowed to leave your suit after a few days. The flight surgeon is constantly bothering you to ask how sweaty you are. Just an incredibly, like, you mentioned that a lot of your work, you wanted to kind of shine a light on kind of small or lesser known space missions. For us, our ethos was kind of looking at the not as fun side of space. Like the idea that certain space missions, a lot of space history we feel has been kind of glamorized to just down to the big moments, when so much of it was trial and error and astronauts eating like gelatin coated Ritz cracker sandwiches or smoothie meals, just all of the objectively fun and hilarious stuff that happened to make everything possible today.
Yeah.
I really loved when we were talking about building up to Gemini 7 was the part of the testing where they were trying to experiment on the long-term, like, what would happen to you if you just stayed in a suit for days on end? experiments.
How
and
you
then
basically gas yourself because of the neck ring of the suit.
yeah, and how
yeah.
the astronauts refused to participate in the test, and so they had to get
College students.
college students or interns to do it. It just, I don't know, it's really funny.
If I were an astronaut, I wouldn't want to be wasting my valuable time doing some stupid test like that. You go ahead and get a college student.
But then it is also the ultimate trap, because imagine if you're a college or university student, someone says like, "Hey, do you want to participate in a NASA space mission trial?" Of course you're going to say yes, and then you get there and you find out like, "All right, put this on, get in the suit."
And report on the smells for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's such a perfect build. They're like, here, all right, welcome. Your mission is you're going to put on this suit. All right, now follow me. Come into this room. And they close the door and they leave. And they're like, all right, so you're going to stay in here for about a week, okay? All right, bye. Oh, also, the factoid that you had mentioned about how, like, they forced them to, like, shower in cold water after so that they could collect all of the stuff that came off of them so that they would, like, understand, like, this is how much, like, filth the human body has created over X amount of time. And I'm just like, it's just so amusing to think about.
They thought of everything.
Science. Yeah.
Even in that one moment of I can finally be clean, and no, you're going to get blasted with probably fridge cold water to preserve the microbial life.
And for our guest to kind of circle back, like this, to give you an idea, this is how much we are enjoy the missions like Gemini 7, where we have spent the past 5 minutes just reminiscing about it.
Well, the Gemini program is probably the thing that got me my start in my interest in space. I still remember, I think I wrote an article. Yeah, I wrote an article about this several years ago. But basically, my dad, I was maybe 3, at most 4, but probably 3 years old. So this would be kind of the middle of the Gemini program. And my father went off to work. And my mom put me down in front of the TV, and I was watching a Gemini launch. And, you know, I understood the concept that some spacemen were going to space. Yeah, I'm all in. Let's do this. And I saw the launch, and, well, I, with the impeccable logic of a 3-year-old, came to the conclusion, Dad just left for work. Some guys just went into space. Dad is an astronaut. In reality, he was a field service engineer working for IBM. And I had no idea what a field service engineer was or what IBM was, but I knew what an astronaut was. It's a very complicated
name. It's got to be space related.
Yeah. So that's what finally got me hooked. And, eventually I figured out, okay, Dad's is not an astronaut. I don't see him on the astronaut list. But that got me started. And then, of course, I got to see the Apollo 11 moon landing and the first moonwalk. And, I've been hooked.
Oh, sweet.
I must post this image into the Riverside chat. Just seeing the Beat Army t-shirt just pressed right up against the window of Gemini 7. For some reason, this has drawn me into just
the first orbital owning of a man is just seeing that sign pressed up again.
Just to have that change, you still got about 3 or 4 days left of your 2-week jaunt in orbit. And just to have a change, you look out the window, you're doing something different. There are some guys that you work with or out there, have a little fun. And man, what a letdown that must have been after they left.
Oh, yes.
And they get to go up. They get to go up on their 1-day mission. They get to stay nice and clean. For those episodes, I spent a really long amount of time reading through the transcript and then painstakingly finding those moments in the audio logs. And I distinctly remember whenever Gemini 7 floated up, the first thing that happened was they got over the radio and started blasting Christmas music on a harmonica badly.
Yes.
You're too much, 6.
It's little things like that I have to say really just foster my interest in this.
There's a human side.
Yes, very much. And I those guys, they lived hard and they played hard.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, the corned beef sandwich.
Oh, yeah.
And it's those little things that just drew me in closer to all of this, to just really reading into some of the stories. Because it starts off as, wow, this is the first case of orbital trolling, and then you just start digging deeper.
And then you had Buzz Aldrin with his first in space selfie.
Yeah, just little things like that.
I didn't know that one.
Oh yeah, I don't know if it's if it's really the first time someone took a selfie in orbit, but I that's the first one that I can think of, and it frequently comes up online as being the first selfie in space.
Oh, okay, yeah. The first EVA, yeah.
Yeah, the first EVA selfie. Yeah, you should. Although
I'm looking at a picture of it now, it looks yeah. What would that have been?
Gemini
it
was one of the
12.
last Gemini flights.
Yeah. Oh, that is cool. And he's even got the visor up so you can actually see his face.
Yeah, which is really rare.
Yeah. I can imagine the sun is very bright in that picture.
Yeah.
And if you have anything you'd like to plug, any things you'd like to point our listeners towards?
So I got that would be 2 plugs. One would be for the Drew Ex Machina website. Like I said earlier, I've been not publishing too much of late because I've been so busy with publishing stuff and working on my day job. And that's for the Hurricane Hunter satellites being built by Tropical Weather Analytics. And we have our website, weathersats.com, all one word. And that has a lot of detailed information about the satellites that we're building, these CubeSats to do stereo observations of clouds from orbit, as well as a bunch of pretty pictures that I've created over the past several years from our earlier projects with NASA on the International Space Station.
Oh, look, there they are, the little guys. I love them.
They're literally about the size of a large shoebox. That's how big they're going to be.
You said they were 6U, right?
Yep, 6U satellites, each one.
Oh, okay.
And currently we're working to get our first ones into orbit. Fingers crossed, maybe next year. And ultimately, we're looking at an initial constellation of 5 pairs of satellites.
Oh, that is cool. Yeah, and it kind of goes to show all the different applications for satellites, like weather tracking. I'm surprised there hasn't been much more of it, honestly.
Well, there are companies out there that have been trying to do doing weather. And I think, NOAA has an open call for any type of commercial sources of information. And I'm trying to remember. I think it's Planet IQ is doing radio occultation measurements using GPS satellites to probe the atmosphere. Tomorrow IO just recently launched one of their orbiting weather satellites. So like a weather radar. So instead of having a ground-based radar tracking storms, you'd have a constellation of radar satellites tracking the weather for remote regions. So there's definitely a market out there for weather satellites, and that's only a couple of examples that pop to the top of my head.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. It's very interesting work, as well as, like I said near the start, we have sourced from it a whole bunch. It's just very hundreds of articles, very interesting reads on just a whole bunch of interesting and obscure space missions. So Drew, thank you for coming on the show. This has been great for us.
And I've enjoyed my time here too. Thank you for inviting me.
Cannot thank you enough.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.